time, Sifters, for organizing this. I'm really happy that you have this community and you are getting together every week to hear talks about archaeology. So,
Can you speak
Use
to
the
mic?
mic.
Yeah.
did you hear anything that I said before?
It was very nice.
At least the thank you part. Okay. So, as Smitty was saying, reading in my abstract, this is part of my work. I'm going to present part of my work in Venezuela and Panama. And as part of my master's and my doctoral dissertation, and I've been doing this work in collaboration with material scientists and archaeologists in Venezuela, Panama, and the US. I'm particularly interested in how archaeology could be useful to review or to give voice to marginalized communities in these different countries that have been erased from history, from national history. And I use the study of technology to give voice to these represented communities. So in this case, I'm going to be presenting on the role of metal technologies and ceramics in Panama and Venezuela, and how, what was their role in the process of interaction between indigenous people or non-Europeans and the Spanish. I'm using scientific methodologies to study to have another perspective on the production, distribution, and use of these materials. And I will be showing how discussions of technology can help us understand the interaction and the response of these communities to the colonial context. So let me find my presentation. So here it is. Okay. For some time, archaeologists have discussed the importance of cultural, social, economic, and political factors in the study of technological change, rather than reducing technology to functional variables for environmental adaptation. Scholars are more interested now in the different ways individuals respond to multiple structural circumstances that influence the impact of foreign technologies and the possible unexpected results of their use. In this presentation, I discuss the role of technology in the colonization of two regions of colonial Latin America, Panama and Venezuela. These two regions differ in the nature of the colonial occupation. Old Panama City was central to the political economy of the Spanish crown, while the Middle Orinoco River was part of the remote colonial frontier. However, their historical accounts share the presence of grand narratives of colonization. According to two archaeologists, Senatore and Funari, I open quote, grand narratives are understood as the normalized and standard view of Spanish and Portuguese colonization of the Americas, which work as a framework of knowledge and interpretation, end quote. So this means that there are versions of the colonial history that are repeated until they are normalized. In Panama and Venezuela, the introduction of European commodities and technologies have been used to support grand narratives. These narratives that exclude local minorities in the history of both regions. Archaeological and scientific analysis of ceramics and metals recovered in these two regions allowed the study of production, distribution, and use of both technologies. The results are used to discuss historical narratives that assume the replacement of native technologies to show the continuity of local practices, the creative incorporation of foreign materials, and the emergence of new forms of social organization. In Panama, archaeologists have made great contributions to the study of utilitarian wares by its definition and identification of its origins and distribution. However, historical references that assume indigenous extinction in eastern Panama drive archaeological interpretations of utilitarian wares. In this presentation, I used the communities of practice approach to show how people from multiple origins engage in the production and consumption of colonial utilitarian wares, linking different social groups in colonial Panama. I argue that communities of potters and communities of consumers of utilitarian ware constituted networks linked by the use of the same raw materials for the production and the distribution of this pottery. Rather than disappearing, the communities of potters from pre-colonial times responded and adapted to the colonial challenges. New communities emerged through the incorporation of new members that diversified the production of utilitarian wares. I use the Venezuelan example to discuss narratives on the impact of metal technologies in colonial context. These grand narratives reproduce the trope of indigenous immediate adoption of foreign technologies based on their supposed efficacy and destructive power. In contrast, the presentation shows the role of metallurgy, especially iron working, in the process of interaction between Indians and colonists in the Jesuit missions of the Middle Orinoco River. I reconstruct the operational sequence or the sequence of production of iron working and the subsequent distribution and consumption of the products in the Jesuit missions. To discuss these two cases, I rely on scientific methods and techniques to characterize archaeological materials and identify their microstructure, chemical and mineralogical compositions. The properties of materials are used to make inferences about the process of production, distribution, and use. I argue ultimately that the analysis of this technology can be useful for reincorporating subaltern groups and knowledges that have been erased, misrepresented, or minimized from history in dramatic ways. The colonial history of Panama began with the Spanish explorations of the isthmus in the early 1500s. That soon led to the foundation of several unsuccessful settlements until 1519, when they established Nuestra Señora de la Asunción de Panama, over here, or how it's called today, Old Panama. This city was the first Spanish occupation on the Pacific coast of the American continent and was very prosperous until for its 152 years of existence. From this key settlement, the Spanish began to expand the occupation on the isthmus and started consolidating the economic route between coasts, as well as developing colonizing projects in the South Pacific coast. This was the situation until 1671, when the pirate Henry Morgan burned down the city and the Spanish moved the settlement about 8 kilometers to the southwest of the peninsula, to what today is known as Casco Antiguo, or the historic district of Panama City. It would be around here. Historical and archaeological sources emphasize the impact of the colonization process and the depletion of natives in Panama, in particular the groups the Spaniards called Cueva, who lived in the eastern or Gran Darien. The historian Castillero Calvo writes that the first period of the colonization occurred when indigenous population collapsed demographically due to the violence of the conquest, slavery, forced labor, and epidemic diseases. Aiming to recover from the shortage of labor, by the year 1530, the colonizers had introduced African and indigenous slaves from other regions. In order to protect native groups, the Spanish crown ordered the foundation of indigenous towns located in proximity to Spanish settlement, and also guarantee the source of labor close to their cities, of course. Since the 1980s, archaeological research in the colonial period has focused mostly on restoration and preservation of archaeological sites such as Old Panama and the Historic District, examining the Spanish way of living and European materiality. The focus of discussion has centered on the definition, origin, distribution, and chronology of locally produced utilitarian wares. Based on the analysis of utilitarian ware recovered in colonial towns from the 16th through the 19th century, and from findings in central Panama, archaeologists describe this ware as oil or slab made and fired at low temperature, with paste color that varies from tan to dark brown. Features such as fire clouds, chalky deposits, and organic crust inside of some bowls, the reduced number of forms, and its association with serving vessels have been used to link this pottery with culinary activities. So these are the pots that people in Panama were using in their kitchen, basically. And my research is based on the analysis of production and distribution of utilitarian wares in colonial Panama. It focuses on the study of raw materials for the manufacture of ceramics through chemical and mineralogical analysis to identify the composition of the recipes people use in manufacturing of utilitarian ware. In this presentation, I include evidence from neutron activation analysis, or NAA, and petrographic analysis of 192 pre-Columbian and colonial samples collected in previous archaeological projects from sites in the central and eastern Panama, in both regions. So this would be eastern Panama, or Gran Darien, and this is central Panama, or Gran Cocle. And these are the two main colonial towns. The analysis followed the archaeometry laboratory at the University of Missouri standard procedure, or NAA. This kind of analysis consists in the bombardment of the samples with neutrons that transform the compounds of the nucleus into unstable radioactive isotopes that decay at different rates. The decaying isotopes emit gamma rays that are characteristics of each element. These counts are turned into element numerical values per sample in a data set. So that's how this method helps us identify the chemical composition of the ceramics. Principal component analysis, technique and statistical techniques used to manage a great number of variables was conducted to define clusters of chemically similar samples using 32 of the 33 elements recorded for each sample. PCA results show that the first 7 principal components, or PCs, explain 89.16% of the variability in the data set. The first 2 principal components account for 39 and 31 respectively. The projection of PC1 and PC2 in a plot permits the visual identification of 3 chemical groups. Okay, so these 3 clusters are samples that have the similar chemical composition, and you could see that each cluster, we could define each cluster as a recipe for ceramics. So we have here 3 recipes that people were producing in Panama. So group 1, this one, consists of 53 samples and 7 outliers. Group 2 consists of 57 samples, 3 of which are outliers, and group 3 consists of 82 samples and 3 outliers. This one, group 1, 2, and 3. And these are the elements that form the groups, the clusters, how they are separated by the presence of these different elements. I conducted another PCA projection to identify the relationship between chemical composition and pottery style. According to the results, the samples of utilitarian colonial pottery are part of 3 chemical groups with 20 samples in group 1, 22 samples in group 2, and 31 samples in group 3. So So here you can see again group 1, group 2, and group 3. Utilitarian colonial ceramics with a group with the pre-Columbian ceramics from both eastern and central Panama. The majority of pre-Columbian ceramics from central Panama cluster in chemical group 1 and group 2, while group 3 reunites ceramics from eastern Panama. To summarize, NAA demonstrates that potters continue using the same raw materials for the recipes used for pre-Columbian ceramics to manufacture colonial utilitarian wares in both the central and eastern regions. Out of 73 colonial utilitarian samples included in the analysis, a total of 31 have the same chemical composition as the pre-Columbian wares produced in the eastern region. The other 42 samples have the same chemical composition as the pre-Columbian ceramics produced in the central region. Based on the results from the 2 consecutive Panama City settlements, Old Panama and the Historic District, the production of colonial utilitarian wares with recipes from eastern Panama seems to decrease over time. Mary Ownby, another colleague archaeologist, conducted a petrographic analysis of 14 samples. Based on the results, she suggests that for both the pre-Columbian and colonial periods, there was a complex pattern of production and distribution of pottery. Petrographic results show that the raw materials used in the production of pre-Columbian sherds from eastern Panama with igneous intrusive sand temper come from a site 15 to 20 kilometers northeast of Old Panama. The sherds from central Panama were possibly produced near the sites of collection, and in some cases, one site of production might have supplied more than one site. In the colonial period, the use of local and non-local pottery continues, but the use of igneous intrusive sand temper declines, while the use of rock-tempered sedimentary clay pastes increases. The combination of the chemical and mineralogical results shows that people in colonial Panama were using the same raw materials as pre-Columbian potters, although they were diversifying recipes and techniques in the production of this technology. In a context with as much geological diversity as Panama, the fact that people were selecting the same raw materials to produce recipes and the continuity of this practice through time reflects the intentional decisions or a matter of tradition. The shared use of the same materials from within a diverse range of possible geological resources is probably tied to cultural transmission and not environmental constraints. Historical sources show some of the ways that new communities of practice emerged in colonial Panama. After the foundation of the colonial towns, indigenous communities started working for the colonial order in different tasks, such as mining, pearl fisheries, farming, clearing roads, or construction. Examples of inter-ethnic cooperation in these activities where existing communities incorporated new members are present in the documents from colonial Panama. I suggest that the participation of members from different ethnic groups engaged in productive activities foster the emergence of new communities of practice in the colonial order. In the same way, other non or less documented daily activities, such as ceramic production, played a significant role in the configuration of colonial communities of practice. Rather than understanding the indigenous involvement in these colonial productive practices as the disappearance or acculturation of indigenous people, I propose to interpret this as the process in which non-Europeans participated with their knowledge and praxis in the formation or articulation of new communities. This research on utilitarian ware is an example of how Europeans did not simply replace pre-Columbian knowledge, materiality, and technology. This argument does not intend to ignore the impact of the colonial presence in the area, but rather to address the impact of narratives that continuously repeat the complete extinction of indigenous population and minimize the contributions of non-Europeans to colonial settings, erasing them from history. Although the colonial occupation was a violent process with massive deaths of indigenous groups, it does not mean that they completely disappeared. Under new circumstances, some people continue producing pottery and incorporated new members that diversified their products. This is a turn from previous interpretations about the Spanish replacement of rejection of non-European knowledge, materiality, and technology. In contrast, it shows how Europeans depended on previous indigenous structures of production and distribution, and how non-Europeans participated and contributed to the emergence of colonial Panama. The next case takes place in the early 18th century when members of the Jesuit Catholic order based in Santa Fe de Bogotá, Colombia, penetrated the Orinoco River from the west to achieve control of the fluvial route connecting the missions of the Andes, Orinoco, and Trinidad. To attain this goal, they established a series of reductions via the resettlement of various indigenous people under the supervision of a missionary and a small group of soldiers and slaves. Indigenous people living in the Orinoco region had been drastically affected by epidemics, wars, and slave raids led by Europeans and Indians allies. Europeans that were coming from the Atlantic and getting in contact with indigenous people and enslaving indigenous people in the area next to or in the shores of the Orinoco River. At this time, the Jesuits finally gained a foothold in the Middle Orinoco, where they established several reductions. Their project was to civilize the indigenous people through the imposition of Catholicism and European way of life. In order to attract the Indians to the new settlements, the missionaries offered protection from the slave raiders and access to European goods. Although these strategies proved effective with some indigenous groups, the survival of missions was fraught with problems. These Jesuits' missions were located in a peripheral region with little military aid and limited supplies, and were exposed to attacks and internal uprisings, as well as frequent epidemics. Despite these difficulties, the Jesuit missionaries introduced cattle and horses and encouraged the neophytes to plant farms where they grew both traditional crops and new cultigens like plantains, rice, and sugarcane. Notably, crafts such as carpentry and blacksmithing were carried out in the missions. Archaeological research conducted by Franz and Kay Scaramelli, Venezuelan archaeologists, in the 1990s on the right bank of the Orinoco led to the location and mapping of several of these colonial settlements. Their systematic surface collection, mapping, and limited excavation of 19 sites where they recover more than 20,000 fragments, including ceramics, glass, lipids, beads, and metal items. The archaeological evidence allowed the identification of indigenous settlements, forts, cemeteries, and colonial missions and towns, and led to the definition of an occupational sequence of 5 periods from the late pre-Hispanic to the 20th century. So this is the Orinoco River and the sites that they identified. The 603 metal fragments analyzed for my research, were recovered from 6 early colonial period sites. The vast majority of the artifacts are iron, 94%, whereas the rest are lead, silver, and copper. Most of the iron fragments were recovered from the Pueblo de los Españoles site, identified in the literature as Nuestra Señora de los Ángeles de Pararuma, founded by the Jesuits in 1734. At the Pueblo de los Españoles site, structural remains led to the tentative identification of residential, administrative, religious, and productive areas. So this is the site, and each one of these dots is a collection point, and this is the productive area, and This would be the blacksmith shop. It's oval stain of stamped ground, and there they recover most of the metal items. And 50 meters from it is a small structure, a mound that it's identified as a furnace structure. The collection of metal artifacts was classified into 21 categories according to historical and inferred uses. Metallurgical production categories were concentrated almost exclusively in the area of the blacksmith shop. This consists of several metal fragments, bars, and slag. Some fragments are likely to be waste of recycled material, such as iron and some lead. At this point, the evidence seems to indicate that it was a smelting and a forging site. In order to learn more about the iron production process, we turn to metallurgical analysis. So here you can see slags of different sizes, bars, and also this slag that was tried to turn into a bar, but it was rejected at the end. Analysis were performed with the collaboration of material scientists from the Universidad Central de Venezuela and the Venezuelan Institute for Scientific Research. Metallurgical methods used were metallography using optical and electron microscopy, and chemical and structural analysis through elemental chemical microanalysis by energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, or EDX. The metallographic analysis of artifact sections surface, this analysis informs about technological decisions such as techniques of manufacture, the thermal history of the artifacts that creates different arrangements of the microstructure, the use of different alloys that present characteristic microstructures, and the degree of corrosion of the object. The qualitative composition of the artifact is obtained through analysis by X-ray diffraction, XRD, that allows the identification of the crystalline structure of materials. The last technique, carbon-sulfur analysis, informs the temperature reach and techniques used in the production of the metal artifacts. For the analysis, we chose 8 metal artifacts recovered from the area of the blacksmith shop. The study of two slags by a scanning electron microscope in primary electrons mode showed that the morphology of the faces present in the structure are irregularly shaped, coinciding with the slag formed in the reduction process. The semi-quantitative chemical microanalysis obtained through EDX technique coupled with SEM, or scanning electron microscope, revealed high iron content, resulting from an incomplete separation of the metal and the gangue material. The composition of the slag may correspond to material obtained from the geological Sinaruco Formation that stretches from the north bank of the river Orinoco to the Villacoa River Valley on the south shore near the mission settlement. The other artifacts analyzed were 2 bars, 2 nails, 1 iron projectile point, and 1 knife. In general, the pieces present extensive areas of protective ferrite in the form of large plates. This. And in most cases with small islands of perlite, and with this, plus slag inclusions in globular forms or slag stringers as a result of a strong forging process. So the slag inside their microstructure would be these inclusions and these inclusions. In some pieces, the semi-quantitative chemical microanalysis of the slag inclusions reveal the same composition of the slag analyzed from the site. confirming they could be the result of the same manufacturing process where the slag originated. The presence of manganese content in other inclusions could be explained by the import of raw or recycled materials from the lower Orinoco or Spain, where iron ore is rich in manganese. In addition to metallographic analysis of 4 samples were consistent with XRD results, which indicated magnetite and iron components. The carbon analysis of 4 samples revealed carbon percentage lower than 0.25%, indicating that the samples are from hypotectoid steel, consistent with microstructure revealed under the microscope. So, in addition to the archaeological and documentary evidence, the results of metallurgical analysis were used to make a preliminary reconstruction of the operational sequence of iron metallurgy in the Jesuit missions. So I used documents and also the results from the metallurgical process to understand how they were producing the steps that they were following to produce iron in this site. So due to the presence of slag inclusions in the artifacts, hypotectoid steel microstructure, and low carbon content, we can suggest that the missions work with wrought iron, obtained through a bloomery process. So this is a bloomery process, and it is a smelting technique that consists of reducing the iron directly from the ore at temperatures between 600 to 1200 Celsius, and consolidating it by hammering the bloom to produce raw iron. I divided the whole operational sequence of iron working in the missions into 2 main stages. The first stage was the bloom smithing process. The iron is first separated in solid state from the ore, resulting in a spongy mass, which is then worked during the working stage. This stage requires previous operations that can be inferred through archaeological or ethnographic references, especially from African context. According to ethnographic references, the bloom smithing process requires time, a skilled workforce, and expertise to carry on the technological process effectively. So they needed knowledge about the location of the ores, as well as knowledge about the fuel available in the area, and how to build a furnace that was appropriate for the smelting process and in this bloomery process. The second stage is the forging process, which involves the removal of impurities and the formation of bars and artifacts. Archaeological evidence allows us to suggest that this process took place in the area proposed to be the blacksmith shop of the mission, where the raw materials was supplied in the form of bars of metal and slag. At this stage, the minimum technology needed was a forge and some tools. The process consists of heating the metal until it gains plasticity, then hammering it to remove as much of the slag as possible, while forging the bars. Then the bars can be modified or shaped into different operations to form points, knives, nails, and the like. The artifacts produced and distributed in the missions of Pararuma were essential to the activities carried out by the missionaries and neophytes alike. The metalwork formed part of the missions project in 2 ways. First, it provided the materials required for the maintenance of the farms and ranches. Second, it served to attract and maintain links with indigenous communities. In this colonial setting, the reproduction of a European model and the practice of a foreign technology, either European or African, took a new meaning. According to the missionaries, the Indians preferred to learn the blacksmith work over other craft work in the mission. And this is from a diary from Salvatore Giri, who was a father working in the missions. And he says that on one occasion, an Indian learned to forge in a few days. And he built a small forge. he made adequate repairs on broken axes, nails and hooks, and did other odd jobs. To put it briefly, the natives from the Orinoco have an amazing ability for all mechanical things. Even though blacksmithing was a valued activity and widely spread among the Indians of the missions, there appears to be no continuity in the transmission and popularization of this knowledge, nor enthusiasm for continuing these activities in the context of the Franciscan missions that replaced the Jesuits. To explain the disappearance of native blacksmiths, I can hypothesize that although the Indians liked the blacksmithing, the Europeans and African experts did not teach them all the operational sequences needed to develop the craft without relying on foreign raw materials or expertise. The incorporation of metal technology in the indigenous world was selective and creative. Some indigenous groups adopted metal artifacts in practices related to warfare, productive activities, personal adornment, medical and funeral spheres, to name a few. In general, during the colonial period, the new tools were incorporated into previous practices that continue to be performed based on the same cultural logics. The Indians did not come to depend totally on European technology either. They had their own living technology that was not immediately replaced or abandoned by European practices. Also, the missionaries make it clear that even the most effective metal artifacts for utilitarian tasks, such as firearms, were not always preferred by indigenous people. From the European point of view, technology was used as an ideological strategy of seduction and domination of indigenous people. Missionaries promoted the exchange of metal artifacts and the local production of iron as a means to attract the local population and to introduce a European work ethic. The distribution of iron tools and the monopolization of technological knowledge for bloomery smelting may have played a role in an important strategy that, combined to the banning of the smuggling, guaranteed the continuous provision of local products from the indigenous population. Nevertheless, the natives often resisted these attempts by rejecting or adopting foreign technology in creative ways that have endured even today. Following the expulsion of the Jesuits, the people of the Orinoco did not continue to employ the first part of the operational sequence, the bloomery smelting, as a way to control their own source of raw material. They resorted to forging of scrap iron, reshaping discarded objects, and the exchange of artifacts to obtain the desired products. The role played by the introduction of ceramic production in Panama and the metallurgical production in the religious sites of the Middle Orinoco supports the premise that technology is embedded in more complex processes than automatic replacement or transmission of material culture among groups. The study of these technologies using scientific methods allow the identification of their composition and microstructures to pose archaeological inferences on their production and distribution. Similarly, the analysis of the impact of these technologies allows the discussion of great narratives in Panama and Venezuela. In the Panamanian case, my goal was to situate the utilitarian ware in a larger network of production and consumption in colonial Panama. The study shows how people from multi-ethnic origin, including native populations that supposedly disappeared, engaged and cooperated in colonial productive activities such as ceramic production. The emergence of communities of potters with roots in pre-Columbian knowledge shows the persistence of a creative technological knowledge that resilient people reproduced and shared after conquest. The colonial history of the Orinoco sheds light on how the impact of metal technologies transcend common historical narratives that emphasize violence, the slave raids, and war among the indigenous from the Orinoco River. Metal technologies were also embedded in local systems of reciprocity, sociality, interethnic alliances, and subsistence economies. The development and adoption of technology must then be understood as related to multiple variables, including social, cultural, economic, and political factors that determine the transfer of material culture and technologies. In contrast to mechanic explanations of change that minimizes or erases marginalized people from history, both study cases show how non-Europeans participated in the production of ceramics and metals as essential technologies found in Panamanian colonial homes and in the visions of the Orinoco River. And I want to thank all these institutions and people that supported my research in Venezuela and Panama. Thank you.